In recent months, what we've seen is a lot of companies that have been connected to the Conservative Party receiving government contracts. The reason contracts matter is because it's public money, and we're seeing billions and billions of pounds being spent in really non-transparent ways. Normally, under procurement rules, contracts have to go out for what's called a tender. The government can't just give contracts to favourable companies. What's happened under COVID is the government has taken advantage of a rule that's already existed, which is that in emergency situations it is possible to not tender contracts. What's concerning about that is we're seeing firms that have links to government getting more awards. Public First, which received £840,000 to deliver focus groups. They were set up and run by James Frayne, who's a long-term friend of Dominic Cummings, and Rachel Wolfe, who co-wrote the Conservatives' 2019 election manifesto. There's been other companies, a company called Topham Guerin, which are Ben Guerin and Sean Topham, kind of New Zealand social media mavens, who worked for the Conservative Party during the 2019 general election. You might remember when the Conservative Party rebranded its Twitter feed as Fact Check UK. Well, that was Topham Guerin.
Will you apologise for the Conservatives masquerading as a fact check service, misleading voters, and will you promise not to do it again?
No. They've been given £3 million to work on social media messaging around COVID. Topham Guerin have talked before about how important it is to kind of elicit emotion in voters. And often fear and anger are really strong emotive forces. And that's the kind of thing that they're often trying to do with political campaigns. So they worked for the Conservatives and are now back in government involved with COVID messaging. The British government has a wing of the army called the 77 Brigade that are supposedly trying to counter disinformation and fake news online. And if you look at the contract that Topham Guerin signed with the British government, it said that their role was going to be working alongside this 77 Brigade to combat disinformation online. They've told us subsequently, the Cabinet Office, that this hasn't happened, that they're not working with this organisation. But there is something really interesting about a PR firm that really have pushed the boundaries as far as they will go in terms of online campaigning. They have peddled things that really are not true. Like when people search for the Labour manifesto, they would see the first search that would come up was actually a fake Topham Guerin created Labour manifesto that was anti-Labour.
Why were fake websites set up and Google paid so them results would come up higher on Google than Labour's actual manifesto?
Right. I'm afraid the short answer to that question is I haven't got the foggiest idea.
And now they're supposed to be trying to help us combat fake news, almost rewarding people who have eroded trust in government information to then try and get them to increase trust in government information. And I think it's probably not that surprising that in the UK there's been a huge issue with trust in government information during the pandemic. Public First and Topham Guerin aren't the only firms connected to the Conservative Party who've received contracts. Another is a company called Faculty. Faculty has worked with Dominic Cummings in the past. It's a small digital company that's involved with data and analytics and AI. And Faculty has contracts with the NHS, what's called the NHS X, which is the NHS's data store. A lot of these contracts, worth almost £1 million, were kept secret. At Open Democracy, we managed to get hold of them because we threatened to sue the government when they refused to release them to us under freedom of information. What exactly Faculty are doing is not massively clear. A lot of these contracts are written in quite vague terms, but also how they got the contracts in the first place isn't clear. How did a small company that had almost no footprint end up getting government contracts to do with the NHS and data during the COVID pandemic? And it's hard again not to see if people like Dominic Cummings are close to a company, they seem to be getting contracts that others aren't. I think what Britain has tried to do during the COVID pandemic has been to outsource almost every aspect of it. So I've looked at things like contracts given to Conservative linked companies, but actually there's across the piece we've seen tiny companies with turnovers of £20,000 been given £100 million contracts to deliver PPE. We've also seen a huge amount of outsourcing. The number of contracts that people like Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, McKinsey have been getting from government. It feels like what happened at the start of the pandemic was government didn't know what to do, so it just brought in management consultants. This was damaging. It meant that they didn't know what they were doing. Why would an accountancy firm be the best people to go to try and get personal protective equipment for the NHS? The reason contracts matter is because it's public money. This is taxpayers' money that is spent in this way. And we're seeing billions and billions of pounds being spent in really non-transparent ways. We will all accept that during a pandemic, some things will change, some normal rules will not apply. But that's not the same as giving out hundreds of millions of pounds to consultancy firms with no contracts and no tender process, or giving out large sums of money to PR firms that are directly linked to the party of government, to the Conservative Party. When that happens, and there's no transparency about why and the process by which that's happening, I think everybody would have a concern. Now more than ever, it's so important to have a light shone on the reality of our politics and our democracy. And it's harder and harder to do that. So do think about helping and subscribing to support independent journalism that's holding power to account and shining a light into the darkness. Join Double Down News on Patreon.